When a struggling farmer bought the worst 40 acres in Iowa, he thought he was buying his last chance. Not a hidden fortune, but buried on that land, locked inside a forgotten shed, was a secret untouched for decades. Who hid it there? And why was it never meant to be found? Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Peter Grayson stood at the edge of 40 acres. No one wanted land in rural Iowa so dry, cracked, and lifeless that even the wind seemed to avoid it. People in town laughed when they heard he paid just $100 for it. That land isn't worth the gas it takes to drive there, they said. But Peter wasn't laughing. This wasn't just land to him. It was his last shot. At 52, with debts piling up and a lifetime of hard work slipping through his fingers, Peter knew he didn't have time for another mistake. His small farm had already failed once. His family had left. And this forgotten patch of earth was all he had left to prove he wasn't finished. The first time he stepped onto the property, something felt off. Too quiet. Too still. Like the land was hiding something, or waiting. Then he saw it. Half buried behind dead weeds and twisted branches stood an old wooden shed, leaning, broken, but still standing. It wasn't on any map. It wasn't in the sale listing. And for reasons he couldn't explain, Peter felt it immediately. If he walked away now, he might lose more than just land. He might lose the only chance he had left, to uncover something that could change everything. Peter Grayson didn't plan to explore the far edge of the property that day. His goal was simple: mark the boundaries, take notes, maybe figure out where the soil was least hopeless. But something kept pulling him deeper into the land, past the cracked earth and patches of stubborn weeds, toward a corner that felt untouched. The air changed as he walked. It grew heavier, quieter. Even the sound of his boots crunching against dry soil seemed swallowed by the stillness. Peter paused, scanning the horizon. Nothing but dead grass, leaning fence posts, and silence stretching in every direction. Then he saw it. At first, it looked like nothing more than a pile of collapsed wood tangled in vines. But as he stepped closer, pushing aside thorny branches that clawed at his jacket, the shape became clearer. A shed, old, forgotten, and wrong. Peter frowned. He had studied every document before buying this land, every blurry photo, every line of description. There was no mention of a structure. Nothing about a shed. Nothing about anything standing back here. So why was it here? The building leaned at an unnatural angle, its wooden boards blackened with age and rot. Parts of the roof had caved in, leaving jagged openings where faint sunlight slipped through. Moss crept along the edges like it had been feeding on the place for decades. But it was still standing. That alone didn't make sense. Peter circled it slowly, his instincts sharpening. Years of farming had taught him to read land, to notice what didn't belong. And this didn't belong. Then he reached the door, and everything changed. The door wasn't just shut. It was locked. A thick, rusted chain wrapped tightly around the handle, secured by a heavy padlock that had long since corroded into a solid mass. Peter stepped back slightly, his heart beginning to pound. Why would anyone lock something out here, and then abandon it? If the land had truly been worthless, as everyone claimed, then what was worth protecting? He ran a hand over the chain. It was old, decades old, but not broken, not disturbed, no signs of tampering, which meant one thing. No one had opened this door in a very long time. A strange tension crept into his chest, part fear, part excitement. His mind raced with possibilities, most of them bad, chemicals, old equipment, maybe even something dangerous. He should walk away. That's what a smart man would do. But Peter Grayson hadn't bought this land to play it safe. This was his last chance. And something deep inside him, Something he couldn't ignore was telling him this shed mattered. More than the land. More than the price. Maybe more than anything. He looked around, half expecting someone to be watching him. But there was nothing. Just silence. Just that feeling, like the land itself was holding its breath. Peter exhaled slowly, then reached down and grabbed a length of rusted metal pipe lying nearby. It was heavy. Solid enough. He hesitated for just a second, because he knew once he did this, there was no going back. Whatever was inside that shed had been hidden for a reason, and opening it meant stepping into something he didn't understand. Something that could change everything. His grip tightened. With a sharp breath, he jammed the pipe into the chain and pulled with all his strength. The metal groaned. The chain rattled violently. For a moment, nothing happened, just resistance, like the past itself refusing to let go. Then suddenly, snap! The lock shattered. The chain fell to the ground, with a heavy thud that echoed far louder than it should have. Peter froze. The sound seemed to ripple across the empty land, as if something had just been awakened. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he reached for the door. His hand trembled. Not from weakness, but from the overwhelming certainty that whatever waited on the other side was the reason this land had been abandoned, and the reason he was meant to find it. The door creaked open slowly, painfully, like it hadn't moved in decades. A thick cloud of dust and stale air burst outward, forcing Peter Grayson to step back, covering his mouth as the smell hit him. It was heavy, suffocating, a mix of rot, mildew, and something older, something metallic, almost like rusted iron left in the rain for years. For a moment, he hesitated. Every instinct told him to walk away. But instead, he stepped inside. The light from outside barely reached the interior. Shadow swallowed everything just a few feet in. Peter reached into his bag, pulled out a flashlight, and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness and revealed chaos. Broken furniture lay scattered across the dirt floor. Rusted tools were piled in corners, unrecognizable beneath layers of decay. Shelves sagged under the weight of jars filled with murky liquid, their labels long gone. Cobwebs stretched from wall to wall like thick curtains, undisturbed for years. It looked exactly like what you'd expect from an abandoned shed. Until it didn't, because at the far end of the room, something was different, neat, intentional. Peter narrowed his eyes, slowly stepping closer. There, in sharp contrast to the disorder around it, sat a stack of wooden crates, not tossed aside, not forgotten. Placed carefully, almost protected. His heartbeat quickened. Why would anyone organize this and leave everything else to rot? He muttered under his breath. He crouched down in front of the nearest crate. The wood was aged, cracked, but still solid. One of the lids had shifted slightly open, just enough to reveal darkness inside. For a second, he didn't move, because something about it felt deliberate, like it was waiting. Finally, with a slow breath, Peter reached out and lifted the lid. The hinges groaned softly, and what he saw inside made his chest tighten. Bundles of paper, old, fragile, yellowed with time, carefully tied together with brittle string. He picked one up gently, as if it might fall apart in his hands. Beneath it, he noticed something else, a tightly rolled sheet of parchment, and on top, a stack of black and white photographs. Peter swallowed hard. This wasn't junk. This was preserved. He turned on the flashlight fully and leaned closer, lifting one of the photographs. A family stared back at him. A man, a woman, 2 children, dressed in early 1900s clothing, standing stiffly in front of a large farmhouse. Their expressions were serious, almost haunting. But what sent a chill down his spine wasn't just the photo. It was the background, because behind them, faint but unmistakable. Was this land? The same land he was standing on right now. Peter's breath caught. This is from here. His hands trembled slightly as he set the photo down and unrolled the parchment. A blueprint. Detailed, precise. Lines marking rooms, corridors, structural supports. But it wasn't for any building above ground. No, this was something else entirely. Something beneath. Peter's eyes scanned the page faster now, his pulse racing. Then he saw it. A symbol drawn in one corner. An upside-down triangle. Inside it, 2 letters, C-R. He frowned, confused. What does that even mean? But before he could think further, something else caught his attention. Tucked beneath the papers, almost hidden, was a small, worn leather journal. He froze, because somehow he already knew. This was the key. With careful hands, he picked it up and opened it. The pages crackled softly, brittle with age, and on the very first page, a name, written in dark, fading ink. Jonathan Grayson. Peter's entire body went still. Grayson, his last name. A cold wave washed over him. Coincidence? No, it didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like something else, something deeper. As he flipped through the pages, the words began to tell a story, one of fear, preparation, and something hidden beneath the land. A refuge, built in secret, designed to survive something the world above never would. Peter slowly looked up from the journal, his mind spinning. The shed, the crates, the blueprint, the name. This land wasn't abandoned. It had been left behind on purpose, and whatever had been hidden here was still waiting, buried, right beneath his feet. Peter Grayson didn't sleep that night. He sat alone at the small wooden table in his rented room, the journal open in front of him, its fragile pages illuminated by a dim lamp. Outside, the world was silent, but inside his mind, everything was shifting. Over and over, he read the name again. Jonathan Grayson. The same last name. It echoed in his thoughts like something unfinished, something calling out across time. At first, Peter tried to explain it away. Coincidence? Just a name. Nothing more. But the deeper he read into the journal, the harder that lie became to believe. Because Jonathan wasn't just a farmer. He was a planner, a builder, a man who saw something coming long before anyone else did. The entries told a story of fear, not panic, but calculated concern. He wrote about instability, about the fragility of society, about how quickly everything people depended on could disappear, crops failing, markets collapsing, people turning desperate. And instead of waiting for disaster, he prepared, meticulously. Page after page described the construction of something hidden beneath the land, a refuge, reinforced with stone, stocked with food, water, and books. That detail struck Peter the hardest. Books. Not just survival, but knowledge. Jonathan hadn't been trying to escape the future. He had been trying to preserve it. Peter leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, his chest tight. All his life, he had believed land had value only if it could produce something: corn, wheat, money. If it didn't, it was worthless. That's what everyone had told him. That's what he had believed when he bought those 40 acres. Cheap land, last chance, nothing more. But now, everything felt different, because this land wasn't empty. It was chosen by a man who had seen beyond his own lifetime. A man who had poured everything not into wealth, but into something meant to last. Something meant to be found. Peter's eyes drifted back to the blueprint, to the symbol, to the shed, to the way everything had been hidden, but not destroyed. It was never meant to disappear. It was meant to wait. For someone, a slow realization began to settle over him, heavy and undeniable. This wasn't luck, he whispered. His hands tightened slightly on the edge of the table. This was left behind for a reason. For the first time since buying the land, Peter didn't feel desperate. He didn't feel like a man clinging to his last opportunity. He felt chosen, and that terrified him. Because if this wasn't just land, if this was a legacy, then it came with responsibility. A responsibility he wasn't sure he was ready for. He thought about the money he needed, the debts waiting for him, the life he had almost lost. And then he thought about Jonathan, a man who had everything to protect, and still chose to build something for a future he would never see. Peter closed the journal slowly, his hands steady now but his heart heavier than ever. He wasn't standing on worthless land. He was standing on someone else's life's work, someone's hope, someone's warning, and maybe someone's trust. The next morning, when Peter returned to the property, everything looked different. The cracked soil didn't seem dead anymore. It felt like a surface hiding something deeper. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. And the shed no longer looked like a ruin. It looked like an entrance. Peter stood there for a long moment, staring at it, the journal tucked under his arm. He knew now without a doubt, whatever was buried beneath that land wasn't just valuable, it was intentional. And if he walked away now, he wouldn't just be leaving behind money. He would be abandoning a story that had waited decades to be finished. A story that, somehow, had chosen him to continue it. Peter Grayson didn't waste another day. By sunrise, he was already back on the land journal in one hand, shovel in the other. His mind locked onto a single thought. Find it! Every page of Jonathan Grayson's journal had become a map. Not a clear one, but enough. Clues hidden in words, references to trees, shadows, distances, subtle details that only made sense if you stood exactly where Jonathan once had. Peter moved slowly around the shed, comparing what he saw with what was written. Not beneath, behind, he murmured, recalling a line that had changed everything. He stepped around the back of the structure, where thick, overgrown bushes had swallowed the ground. The area looked untouched for decades, wild, tangled, almost deliberately hidden. And that's when he felt it. A difference. He pressed his boot into the soil. The sound wasn't solid. It was hollow. Peter froze. His heart began to pound so loudly it drowned out everything else. This is it. Without hesitation, he dropped to his knees and started digging. The earth here was softer, looser, like it had once been disturbed, and then carefully covered again. Each shovel full came up easier than the last. His movements grew faster, more desperate, driven by something deeper than curiosity now. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. He lost track. Then, thud! The shovel struck something solid. Peter stopped breathing. Slowly, he cleared the dirt away with his hands. Wood. Old, damp, but still intact. A hatch. Buried, hidden, waiting. For a long moment, he just stared at it, his hands shaking slightly, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. This wasn't theory anymore. This was real. Jonathan Grayson hadn't been writing stories. He had been leaving instructions. Peter wiped the dirt from the edges, revealing rusted hinges and a metal handle nearly fused with age. He grabbed it, hesitated just for a second, then pulled. The hatch resisted. Then slowly, it gave. A rush of cold, stale air escaped from below, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of time sealed away. Peter stepped back, staring into the darkness beneath him. A ladder descended into the earth, and at the bottom, nothing but shadows. He grabbed his lantern, lit it with trembling hands, and lowered himself down. Each step creaked. Each breath felt heavier. The air grew colder, thicker, until finally, his boots touched solid ground. Peter raised the lantern, and what he saw changed everything. The chamber stretched wider than he expected, reinforced with stone and heavy wooden beams that had somehow survived decades underground. Dust covered everything but beneath it. Order. Purpose. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars, tools, and supplies. A table stood at the center, surrounded by chairs as if people had once gathered here, planned here, lived here. But that wasn't what stopped him. It was what sat in the far corner. A chest, large, reinforced with iron. Waiting. Peter moved toward it slowly, his breath shallow, every step echoing in the silence. He reached out, lifted the lid, and froze. Gold. Stacks of coins, dull with age but unmistakable. Silver. Small sacks filled with gemstones that caught the lantern light and reflected it back in sharp flashes. Documents sealed, preserved titles, deeds, papers that spoke of land, wealth, ownership far beyond what this broken farm suggested. Peter staggered back slightly, overwhelmed. This isn't possible. Millions. That's what it had to be. Hidden, forgotten, waiting. But as his eyes moved across the chamber, past the treasure, past the shelves of books, past the carefully preserved supplies, a realization hit him harder than anything else. This wasn't just a hiding place for wealth. This was a plan, a future built in advance. Jonathan hadn't just buried money, he had buried a second chance. And now, it was in Peter's hands. The man who bought the worst land in Iowa was standing on top of something worth more than money could measure, something that could change his life forever, or test him in ways he never expected. Peter Grayson couldn't stop staring at the gold. Even after he closed the chest, even after he climbed back up into the daylight, the image stayed burned into his mind. Coins, gems, documents worth more than he had earned in his entire life. More than enough to erase every debt. More than enough to start over. More than enough to finally win. For the first time in years, Peter allowed himself to imagine it. A new house. Good land. No more worrying about bills stacking up on the kitchen table. No more sleepless nights wondering how long he could hold on. Just peace. Just comfort. You earned this, he whispered to himself. And for a moment, it felt true. After everything he had lost, everything he had been through, maybe this was his reward. Maybe this was how life finally paid him back. But that feeling didn't last, because later that night, sitting alone again with the journal in his hands, something inside him began to shift. He turned the pages more slowly this time, not searching for clues, but listening. Jonathan's words felt different now. He wasn't just writing about fear anymore. He was writing about responsibility, about building something that would outlast him, about leaving behind not just wealth, but purpose. Peter's eyes stopped on one passage. The ink faded, but still clear enough to read. What we store is not for ourselves alone, but for those who will need it when we are gone. Peter swallowed hard. The room felt heavier, because suddenly, the treasure didn't feel like a gift anymore. It felt like a question. What are you going to do with it? He leaned back, rubbing his face, his thoughts racing. Part of him still wanted it badly. He had every reason to take it. No one else knew. No one would ever know. But another part of him, the part that had read every word Jonathan wrote, couldn't ignore the truth. This wasn't hidden out of greed. It was hidden out of foresight, out of care, out of belief that someone, someday, would understand. Peter stood up and walked to the window, staring out into the dark. He thought about the land, about how lifeless it had seemed when he first saw it, and how different it felt now. Not empty, but waiting for something to begin again. The next morning, he drove into town. He didn't go to a bank. He didn't go to a lawyer. Instead, he just walked. He watched people, workers heading into long shifts, parents juggling bills and groceries, kids running through streets with nothing but dust and noise around them, and for the first time, he saw himself in them, struggling, hoping, trying to hold on, and something clicked. The treasure wasn't just about him escaping that life. It was about changing it, not just for himself, but for others. Peter returned to the land that afternoon, standing once again in front of the shed. But this time, he didn't see it as a discovery. He saw it as a responsibility. He walked to the back, to the hidden hatch, and stared down into the darkness below. Everything he needed was there, everything he had ever wanted. But for the first time, he didn't feel consumed by it. He felt challenged by it. "Jonathan," he said quietly, almost like the man could hear him, "you didn't leave this here for someone weak." Peter took a slow breath. His decision wasn't fully formed yet, but the direction was clear. He wasn't just a man who found treasure anymore. He was a man being tested by it. And deep down, he knew, whatever he chose next would define the rest of his life. Peter Grayson made his decision in silence. No announcement, no celebration, just action. The very next week, the land began to change. Not all at once, but enough for anyone passing by to notice. The dead weeds were cleared first, ripped from the soil that had been neglected for decades. Then came the fences rebuilt, straightened, no longer collapsing under their own weight. The ground, once cracked and lifeless, was turned over again and again until it began to breathe. But what truly surprised people wasn't the work. It was who Peter invited to help. He didn't hire wealthy investors. He didn't bring in corporations. He brought in people who needed a second chance, just like he once did. Men who had lost their jobs, families struggling to stay afloat, young people with no direction and no one willing to guide them. At first, they came out of curiosity. Then they stayed because for the first time in a long time, they felt like they mattered. Peter didn't tell them about the treasure. Not at first. Instead, he showed them something better. Opportunity. He used the money quietly, buying tools, seeds, equipment, restoring the land piece by piece, turning it into something no one thought it could ever be again. A farm. A working, growing, living farm. But it didn't stop there. Where the old shed once stood rotting, forgotten, Peter built something new. A wide wooden hall. Strong, open, filled with light. Inside, there were long tables, shelves of books, tools hanging neatly along the walls. It became a place where people didn't just work. They learned. Children came after school, sitting at those tables, flipping through books that had once been buried underground. Adults gathered in the evenings, sharing knowledge, skills, ideas. The land that had once been silent was now alive with voices, laughter, hope, and slowly, word began to spread. People from nearby towns came to see it. At first, they didn't believe it. That's the same land they would ask. The worst 40 acres in Iowa, now covered in green fields, growing crops that fed not just Peter, but dozens of families. The transformation didn't just change the land. It changed lives. Peter worked alongside everyone else. No special treatment, no distance. His hands were just as dirty, his back just as tired. But for the first time in years, he wasn't carrying the weight alone. And sometimes, late in the evening, when the sun dipped low and painted the fields in gold, Peter would walk back to the hidden hatch behind the old shed's foundation. He would descend into the chamber, not to take more, but to remember. The chest was still there, lighter now, but never empty, because he never took more than what was needed. And the portrait of Jonathan Grayson still watched from the wall, silent, steady, as if approving. Peter would stand there for a moment, the lantern light flickering across the stone, and he would feel it again. That same realization that changed everything. This was never about money. It was about what you do when you're given a chance no one else gets. Years passed. The land flourished. The hall became the heart of a growing community. Children who once had nothing now had direction. Families who struggled now had stability. And Peter, the man who bought the worst land anyone had ever seen, had built something far greater than wealth. He had built meaning. On one quiet evening, standing at the edge of the field, watching people gather, laugh, and live, Peter finally understood. He didn't find the treasure. The treasure had found him, and because he chose to share it, it became something that would never run out. Peter Grayson started his journey believing success meant one thing: money. After years of struggle, loss, and failure, he thought that if he could just find enough of it, everything would finally fall into place. And for a moment, standing in that underground chamber, staring at gold and riches beyond imagination, it almost did. But what Peter discovered was far more powerful than wealth. Because money by itself doesn't change your life. What you choose to do with it does. That hidden treasure could have ended his story in comfort and isolation. Instead, it became the beginning of something greater. A second chance, not just for him, but for everyone around him. And that's the truth most people miss. Opportunities don't define you. Your decisions do. Peter didn't become rich because he found treasure. He became meaningful because he chose to share it. If this story made you think differently about success and purpose, hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell so you never miss the next powerful story. And tell me in the comments, if you found that treasure, what would you do with it?